Oh, hello, old friend. It's good to see you. Let's talk about this word, fascination. It describes an unquenchable urge, which compels our hearts to quest and be captivated. As long as there are elegant explanations to complicated phenomena, science will never lose its romance. Over the years, I've traveled the world, indulging in my fascination in physics. And now, I find that a new hunger has woken within me. A fiery need to share these great ideas with the people around me. And so, I have assembled a team of some of the greatest, most lucid, most creative minds I've encountered in my travels. And I call them my Titanium Physicists. You're listening to the Titanium Physicists Podcast, and I'm Ben Tippett. And now, allez, physique! You know shooting stars? Those are caused by little rocks in space, which are about the size of a pebble and which are being vaporized high above you. About 100 kilometers up in the air, they hit the atmosphere going 30 kilometers per second, and they're vaporized, and we see their color, and we could say shooting stars are pretty. And one of my favorite activities of the summer is the mid-August meteor shower. They're called the Perseids because of the constellation they're centered around. And I like to stay out late and stare up at the night sky and watch the stars fall. Well, it might surprise you, but 15,000 tons of space stuff enter the atmosphere each year. Now, it's mostly dust and sand and pebble-sized stuff, but sometimes it's not. Now, I'm going to say two words. Listen carefully. Chelyabinsk, Tunguska. So on February 15th, 2013, a 20-meter asteroid entered the atmosphere above Russia. It was going about 19 kilometers per second, and the heat generated as it pushed through the air was so intense that the meteor heated up brighter than the sun. And as it fragmented and exploded, it released 20 times more energy than an atomic bomb. 1,500 people in the city of Chelyabinsk were injured by broken glass as their windows got blown in. And Tunguska? Well, on June 30th, 1908, either a comet or a meteoroid entered the atmosphere and exploded near the Tunguska River. It exploded at an altitude over 5 kilometers in the air, and the explosion was 1,000 times as energetic as an atomic bomb. Trees were flattened over a region of 2,000 kilometers in size, and windows were shattered hundreds of kilometers away. So the moral of the story is that horrible things can come from space and bash into the Earth. Today we're going to talk about the most world-changing of events when a big rock from space smashes into a planet. Okay, I thought that for an episode on world-changing cataclysms, we should invite on an expert on post-apocalyptic scenarios. And one of my favorite pieces of post-apocalyptic fiction these days is Adventure Time. It's a cartoon about a boy and his magic dog as they have adventures in a magical post-apocalyptic Earth. And one of my favorite things in Adventure Time are Fionna and Cake, the gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake who exist only in the feverish fan fictions written by the Ice King. My guest today is Natasha Allegri. She's a character designer and storyboard revisionist on the Adventure Time cartoon, and she's the creator of Fionna and Cake. Natasha also writes and illustrates the Adventure Time with Fionna and Cake comic books. Hi, Natasha.
Hello.
How you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
I'm so excited. Okay, before we go on, we should note Natasha has a fun Tumblr page where she draws and interacts with her fans. She also writes her cartoon, Bee and PuppyCat, on Frederator's Cartoon Hangover. Links to all these things will be available on our webpage show notes. Okay, Natasha, for you today, I've assembled two fantastic titanium physicists. Now arise, Lissa Ong. Lissa has her master's from UC Santa Cruz in planetary science. She was previously a doctoral candidate in impact shock waves at the University of Arizona. Now arise, Dr. Charlie Barnhart. Dr. Charlie got his PhD from UC Santa Cruz in planetary geophysics. He's currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Global Climate and Energy Project at Stanford University. Charlie's one of the co-hosts of our sister podcast, Science Sort Of. All right, everybody, let's start talking about horrible, horrible events.
So, about 65 million years ago, one of these big asteroids came and hit the Earth. And it is what we think extincted all of the dinosaurs as we know them. And it created a niche for mammals to become more dominant in our Earth's ecosystem. So this was caused by, we think, about a 10-kilometer diameter asteroid. So that's pretty huge compared to the meteorite that Ben just talked about hitting in Chelyabinsk earlier this year. And it hit in the Yucatan Peninsula, although the crater itself, well, it was discovered by some oil companies, I think in the 1950s, but they kind of kept it all hush-hush, and so it wasn't actually published as a potential crater for the dinosaur-killing impact until the 1980s. So the reason we think that it was an impact that killed the dinosaurs, there's a couple of things. There's a layer in between the two geological layers. Underneath, there's the layer that has all the dinosaurs, and then above, there's a rock layer that doesn't have any dinosaurs. So clearly something happened there, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in between those two rock layers that has no business being on Earth. So one of those things is the rare earth element iridium, which comes from outer space and is, the easiest explanation for that being there in a global layer all around the world is because it came from an asteroid impact. And the other thing that we see are these tiny little glass spheres called microejecta that we think are pieces of melted rock and ejecta that blew out of the crater when it was forming and solidified into glass and then kind of rained down all over the Earth. So that's why we think it was an asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs.
Yeah, and I'll say that impact craters aren't necessarily horrible events as they were introduced in the beginning of the show. They're just misunderstood. So every impact event before humans were on the planet were probably in some way good for our evolution. Primordial life dates back all the way, use mitochondrial DNA and RNA to thermophiles. These are archaea bacteria that enjoy very, very hot temperatures. And these were the only sorts of things that probably could have survived in the very, very early Earth when we were constantly being bombarded by impact events. And so they were able to survive the hot liquid water temperatures that were probably throughout the Earth's crust. And life came from these things, and we came from those things. And so those impacts were good for the advent of life as we know it. And then, as Lisa mentioned, getting rid of certain species were conducive to species more closely related to us to come onto the scene. So most impact craters were really, really good for us. It's just the big one that's coming in the future that won't be so great for us. But hopefully we'll be an adaptive and inventive species and figure out a way to defend ourselves.
Whoa. I didn't know there was a meteor coming to Earth.
Statistically, absolutely.
Wow.
What is the rates, Lisa? Maybe once every million years you get something that can make about a 10-kilometer crater?
Yeah, something like that.
Which isn't an extinction-level event, but it would be devastating if it hit a landmass, especially given population centers as they are.
Even just if Tunguska had happened, it was such a huge explosion and it felled, like 80 million trees or something. So if that had happened over an urban center, that would be a major bummer.
Yeah. The Shell Oil Company discovering the Chicxulub crater, which is thought to be responsible for the extinction of dinosaurs, is really pretty curious if you read some of the literature. They were finding gas and oil trapped underneath impermeable layers. That's what oil exploration does all the time, underneath layers of clay, for example. But then they noticed in some regions the entire stratigraphy, so that's the different layering that makes up a rock column. So you can think of it like a cake with frosting and different flavors of cake and different flavors of frosting, was totally upside down next to other places where it was right side up. And so for some reason, the entire rock flipped upside down right next to other bits of rock. And so some places they were finding oil and gas, and other places the rock got flipped upside down, so all the oil and gas leaked out to the surface. They were wondering what could have possibly turned the entire ground surrounding this one central area upside down. And it turns out that impact craters, when they carve out their massive cavity, they produce this lip that builds the rim and eject a curtain that will flip upside down and then lay it down onto the surrounding rim.
So the meteor comes in, it's traveling at, 30 kilometers a second or something. Burns right through the atmosphere because it's a big, giant monster meteor, and it touches the ground. From the moment it contacts the ground, we have good models describing exactly what happens and why meteor craters are shaped the way they are. I just found out this afternoon that we know all about it, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted at how awesome it is. So, interested to know why meteor craters are shaped the way they are?
Of course. I want to hear about the meteor cakes.
Yeah, me too. Come on, Lisa.
Okay, so the biggest misconception about how craters are made is that, so if you drop a bowling ball onto a memory foam bed, and then you pick up the bowling ball again, there's going to be a hole there, right?
Right. That mimics the bowling ball.
That's exactly what doesn't happen.
Oh.
So what actually happens has to do with shock waves. So think about like a sound wave, right? It's just like compression of air going back and forth. Shock waves are just like a sound wave, except they're going super fast. They're going faster than sound through the air. What happens when a crater forms is the asteroid is going super fast and it's going to hit the planet. And as soon as it touches the planet, because the asteroid is going so fast, it's going to release the shock wave into the planet. And the way to think about this is, so imagine that there's a whole bunch of people in a crowded room and everyone's kind of spaced out evenly. And then, like, someone right in the middle of the room, like, throws up, right? That's super gross. Okay, so, like, the people closest to the person vomiting are like, oh, man, I really want to get out of here. So they turn around and start running in any direction that's not towards the guy vomiting, right?
Yeah.
But they're going to run into other people, right? So then they have to, like, push them out of the way. And it sort of becomes this group of people that's pushing further and further and further away from that one central point. And so that's exactly what's happening with the shock wave and the impact. As soon as that asteroid or comet hits the surface of the planet, it sends out this shock wave that pushes all of the rock material further and further and further away from that one central point. It's not the actual asteroid that's like carving out a hole, but the shock, because it's been moving so fast, that pushes the rock out of the way. And that's what makes these round bowl craters, is all of the rock trying to move as far away from that one central point as fast as possible.
Does this shockwave mimic the shape of the meteor at all?
It doesn't really matter what the shape of the meteor is. It could be like a cubic asteroid.
Right.
And if just one corner of that cube hit, as soon as that happens, because it's punching the planet. So as soon as one piece of it that's moving really fast punches the planet, the rest of it will happen.
I see.
So you might be wondering, does this shock just keep going on forever? And like, why don't we just get these like super, super giant holes that are always growing? And the reason that doesn't happen is because the further and further away from the impact point that the shock gets, the weaker and weaker it gets. So just like my analogy with the guy who threw up in the room, like once all the people get far enough away, it doesn't smell so bad, so they stop running. So eventually the shock stops pushing the material away and the hole that's made by the impact stops growing. What I just told you was kind of a simplified version of what happens. Actually, there's not just the shock wave, there's two waves. There's a shock wave and kind of what's like an anti-shock wave, and it's called a rarefaction. So just like the shock wave likes to push everything together, the rarefaction comes behind the shock wave and it likes to pull things back apart. And so both of them are still moving in the same direction away from the center of the impact. It's just that the rarefaction, while it's still pushing things away, is also pulling the individual rocks apart. And so the rarefaction wave is what actually causes the rocks to break into smaller pieces. It's not the shock itself, but the wave that comes after it.
I don't know if it's perfectly accurate, but there's this awesome scene in The Matrix where the helicopter crashes into a skyscraper, and the window in bullet time, it shows these ripples coming away from the moment of impact of the helicopter, and the ripples pass through the glass, but right after the ripple passes through, then the glass explodes. But for a moment there, the glass just shows the ripples. And so the shockwave is traveling, but the rarefaction hasn't happened yet until the shockwave passes, and then it structurally breaks.
I feel like lots of anime explosions do the same thing. Like they'll show this pushing of like rock or boulder, and then like a bright light, and then the rock will explode and like float apart.
Yeah.
And I feel they do
cool.
the same kind of thing in lots of animes, I think.
Yeah. That's right, I think. Yes.
Well, it's a super cool effect. So like,
yeah, it looks beautiful.
Yeah.
In anime.
In addition to talking about the shockwave and the rarefaction, which are the two things that do all the damage, you can also model what happens in these cratering events in terms of what happens to, like, individual rocks.
I'll try to talk a little bit about what would happen to a rock grain that experiences this shock. And so as the shock passes through it, it's going to be compressed to a great degree, and it will experience tremendous pressures. Pressures that are so high that it will change its state based on its individual equation of state. So this is a fancy thermodynamics concept. So the state of matter is determined by things like the pressure, the surrounding pressure, the temperature. So I'm not that smart, so I can think of things like water and the equation of state associated with water. So if it's cold enough, you get ice under atmospheric pressures, and if it's hot enough, it turns into vapor. But it turns out at really high pressures, matter like rock and even ice start doing strange things. And so a particular mineral grain that makes up the rock will, under high compression, begin to reassemble itself molecularly and acquire different mineralogical structures. And so the equation of state will take it to a new state because the pressures got so high. And so often at impact craters, in the bowl of the crater, we find really strange minerals. So quartz, which is a very common mineral, that's what makes up sand, turns into things like coesite and stishovite. So these are very strange arrangements of silicon and oxygen. And so that's kind of the microscopic behavior at these impact sites. And they leave this shock wave, these really high pressures and really high temperatures, leave a mineralogical fingerprint. Do you want me to talk about tubes?
Tubes!
So just like the internet, the excavation of an impact crater is a series of tubes. I don't know, these tubes are really interesting because it's a way to mathematically, quantitatively track what happens to material beneath the crater. You can start at the center of an impact event, right where the bolide kisses the surface of the planet. And from that point, you get these arcs that arc into the surface of the planet, radially away from that central point, and then curve up out of the planet and into the sky. And so anything between two of these arcs, just picture like maybe 10 of them or something, anything between two arcs is a tube. And so all that material within a tube will travel in that same tube from the center of the impact if it started there, or from halfway to the edge of the crater if it started there. But it'll still assume this tubular trajectory, follow that tube, and then be ejected at some velocity. Now, where the tube exits the crater in relation to the center of the impact event will determine how fast it leaves the crater. So stuff that's concentrated in tubes that are very, very close to the center of the crater will eject at extremely high velocities, sometimes so high that they'll escape the gravitational pull of the planet and be ejected into space. Stuff that's further away from the center of the crater won't experience as high velocities and won't travel as far. And it's often the stuff that's further from the center of the crater that contribute to the ejecta blanket. Now, the ejecta blanket is all the shrapnel from the crater that creates this, spray of debris around the crater itself. Some of the first experiments that looked at how these tubes behave were nuclear bomb testing events that occurred in Nevada. And it's really crude experimentation, but it worked well. They just buried a bunch of Coca-Cola cans and numbered them from the point of the explosion, and then they let it off. It was called like Snowflake. I don't know why atomic weaponry always has these cutesy names, because it's pretty effed up if you ask me. But anyway, Snowflake popped, and they went around and tried to figure out where all the cans ended up, and then they could trace their trajectories. Now we have Maxwell's Z model, and that's where the tube theory comes from.
This is just to track where things land after a meteor hits to... I'm sorry, I'm trying to figure out...
It's kind of like this.
You want to know where the ground goes after impact?
Yeah, that's right. Imagine I have a little rock, we'll name him Rocky, and he's sitting kind of near the bottom where the meteor's about to hit. And the meteor hits, and Rocky gets shoved underground. And he goes down under. His trajectory doesn't go straight underground. It kind of bounces back up. And then as he surfaces with quite a bit of speed. And then so he becomes airborne. And he
these
flies.
things go down and then out.
They go down and then they come back out. And the closer the rocks are to the center of the epicenter, the place where the collision happens, the farther they're going to get tossed. They'll bounce back out with a faster and faster speed. And so the stuff really getting close ends up flying really, really, really far out. Like Charlie said, potentially in space. The stuff that's farther out, essentially in the crater, ends up kind of hopping out of the crater or making the crater walls. It kind of gives the crater its shape.
So when you see tubes, it's because these things go around the meteor?
Yeah, well, they go down under the ground and then back out.
So then back out.
Imagining it as a series of tubes is just kind of a visual metaphor.
Think of it like a Space Mountain roller coaster, right? It starts out like at ground level, and the first half there's like a dip and it goes underground, and then it kind of bottoms out, and then there's a climb, and it goes back to ground level, and it keeps climbing above ground level into space, and then it falls back down again onto the ground. So it's like it goes down and then up into space and then back down again. And
so, the one that killed all the dinosaurs, it fused all these little spheres. These spheres went flying as a result of this, these tubes. They rocketed out and got spread all over the Earth. And so anytime you dig down in the Earth, you see this layer of ashy, sphery things.
Spherals of glass. Yeah.
Spherals of glass.
Dragon balls.
Dragon balls.
But that's a real simple look at it. Things get way crazier, and that's why impact science is alive and well. All sorts of things come into effect, like how dense the target is, whether it has porosity, whether it's how the strength of its gravity, all sorts of stuff. But we can get into
layered,
it. Yeah. So the tube model doesn't really work, but it's a good way to start thinking about it. That's how physicists do their stuff, though. They start out with something that they can understand.
And then they give it to the grad students.
Yeah.
So, tubes are lots of fun. So, essentially, this is the things at play that we've talked about, essentially give the craters their shape. But apparently, there are two different types of craters.
So, a lot of what we know about impact cratering at the beginning was just from doing experiments where, literally, people were standing at the tops of buildings and using shotguns and shooting bullets down into little sandboxes at street level. Now they have more fancy experimental impact cratering apparatuses, so they're called gas guns, where they basically shoot little pellets using gas as the accelerant. They were doing these experiments, and it turns out that there's two different regimes for how craters form. So one regime is strength dominated. So remember how we were talking about what stops the crater from actually growing? So there's two different forces at play. One is the strength of the rock. So if you're in a strength-dominated cratering regime, basically once your shock wave gets weak enough, what that means is that it's too weak compared to the strength of the rock to basically bend it and push it out anymore. So that's strength-dominated, and that we usually see on smaller scales. So experimental scales, when we're shooting bullets at targets. But what we see when we study planets are craters that are gravity-dominated. What happens in those is that the gravity of the planet is the force that's actually stopping the crater from growing bigger after a certain point. And the way to imagine that is, have you ever seen one of those super high speed resolution videos of a drop of water falling into a pond?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you see it kind of makes the hole, and then it eventually the hole stops growing, right? And it splashes back up. And sometimes it makes a little mountain in the middle, right? It splashes higher than the water level. And then that thing falls back down and it makes all these ripples, right? So we see the exact same thing happening on craters on planetary scales, which is really, really cool. So in addition to the simple bowl-shaped craters that we see, which are normally the smaller, less energetic ones, the gravity regime or the gravity-dominated craters start changing shapes into really interesting and different-looking things that you might not even recognize as a crater if I showed you a picture of. So we have these simple bowl-shaped craters, and then if it gets a little bit more energetic, like a bigger asteroid or it's moving a little faster, then we get what's called a central peak crater. So it looks like a bowl, but it has a mountain in the middle, which sounds really familiar, right? Because we've seen this in these videos of liquids. And then if we get even more energetic, we see a really big but flat crater that has one or two rings of mountains around them. And then even on some planets, we see what these are called central ring craters or peak ring craters. We see them with up to 10 rings around them. So it looks like kind of those waves that we see in videos of a drop of water falling into like a bowl of water, which is really cool. So it seems like somehow the gravity is freezing these craters at different stages of formation, the bigger and bigger they get.
That's amazing. I Googled pictures of it.
Yeah, you want to see pictures of these things because they're really cool looking.
Yeah,
and we see these all over the place. We see them on rocky planets like the Moon and Mercury, and we see them on icy planets or icy satellites like Europa, which is one of Jupiter's moons. So we see these whole different range of crater shapes all over the solar system. And it basically just depends on how big and energetic the asteroid or comet is that you're hitting compared to the gravity of the planet and how strong the material is that you're hitting it into.
So if a planet has a huge amount, like a very high level of gravity, is the crater going to have less of that shockwave impact?
So the bigger the planet, the more gravity it has, which just means you need a way more energetic impactor to make the same shape of crater that you'd see on a smaller planet. They're bigger on smaller gravity planets than they are on bigger gravity planets. So because these things are gravity dominated, the bigger your gravity, the smaller the crater diameter you need to get these multi-ring impact craters or multi-ring basins.
Oh, okay.
Does this mean that we're going to see more of the really cool, like, wavy craters on moons than we'll see on, like, big planets like the Earth or, you know, Venus?
Yeah, well, so one other thing to keep in mind, though, is that, for example, Mercury is closer to the sun, so in general, the things hitting it will be going faster because they're getting sucked in by the sun, and so they get accelerated a little more. So it's kind of hard to tease out the different effects by just looking at the different crater populations on each planet. But yeah, I mean, Europa, which is an icy satellite of Jupiter, is about the size of our moon. And we see lots of these ring crater structures on Europa and on Ganymede, which is another one of the icy satellites. If you want to see the equivalent structure on Earth, it has to be a way, way bigger crater. So on Europa, those ring structures happen for craters that are like 40 kilometers in diameter. But on Earth, a 40-kilometer diameter crater wouldn't necessarily have all of those rings going around it. It would be a more traditional shape.
All right, Natasha, should we move on to the thing that blew my mind this morning? Okay.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Okay, Charlie, tell us about the thing on Mars.
All right, so impact events are incredible geological events. And this actually wasn't even known until like the 60s. A guy who started thinking about impact events as a geological phenomena like a volcano or a plate tectonic or something was Eugene Shoemaker. It turns out, I mean, they're one of the most significant geological events. We just don't see them on a daily basis, and so we just didn't realize that it was occurring. And if you're going to be a planetary scientist, you have to pay homage to impact craters because they define the planetary bodies, and you can use them as clean slates to determine what happened once one has formed to a particular area of a planet. And so some of the most exciting things, of course, are the biggest impact crater events that have happened on a particular planetary body. And usually, planetary bodies kind of max out. You can get an impact event just big enough until you don't entirely destroy the planet. And so one planetary body that suffered from about as big of an impact event as it could have without completely being destroyed was Mars. And so I don't know if you've ever seen the globe of Mars. It's most easily seen if you look at a topographic map. It turns out Mars, the entire northern hemisphere of Mars is low, and the entire southern hemisphere of Mars is high. And if you look at the surface features, the northern hemisphere of Mars doesn't have too many craters. The southern hemisphere has about as many craters in a given area as the moon. It's just totally riddled with craters. One of the most prominent theories for explaining this is that Mars suffered a massive impact event, so big that the entire half of the planet is an impact basin, and then the other half of the planet is a big ejecta rim.
Oh, whoa.
It's like half of Mars got pied in the face.
Right, it's like a sucked-in face.
It's absolutely incredible, and anything much bigger than that would have totally destroyed the planet. And so the whole northern half probably was liquefied, became a magmatic ocean. The planet probably oscillated like a piece of silly putty, squeezed inward and outward over the course of a few days. It probably scattered a tremendous amount of ejecta that smashed into moons that may have existed before the two moons that are there now. Mars was a very, very different place before this happened.
So for a while it wasn't spherical?
Yeah, it's actually not terribly spherical now. It's like kind of an onion, and you know how onions have layers? It's like the top half of the onion missing its top layer. So it's like a Kinder Egg or something, I don't know.
Right. Wow.
And it's totally redefined the planet. It's doing these incredible things. So now it's called the dichotomy, and a dichotomy just means a difference between two different things. And so it's this polar dichotomy that controls weather, because there's a highland and a lowland. It controls like the movement of water and carbon dioxide. It controls temperature in various places. And so I think it's pretty amazing. It totally redefined the planet. But other planets have been entirely redefined by impact events too.
Okay, so actually it turns out that Earth got pied in the face too once upon a time. Way, way back when, like 4.5 billion years ago, when the Earth was just forming. Well, so let me back up. So the definition of a planet, this is very controversial because, Pluto got demoted as a planet. It's not a planet anymore, it's a dwarf planet. So part of the definition of a planet is an object that is orbiting around the sun. It's basically gravitationally cleared its own path, right? So it's like Pac-Man, right? And like everything that's in its path around the sun, each little planet Pac-Man has eaten. So that's the definition of a planet. But when the solar system was still forming, all those little Pac-Man planets were still kind of taking care of all the little leftover scraps and eating everything that was in its orbit as it went around the sun. So it turns out that when the Earth was still a brand new baby Earth and everything was molten and, it had just basically formed, there was another little planet in an orbit that crossed what we now think of as Earth's orbit. And they actually crashed into each other. So this other planet was about the size of Mars, and they didn't crash head on. They kind of like whiffed each other, and they whiffed each other really slowly. So it's kind of like the slow motion,
It's like two boys starting a fight in middle school where they hit shoulders against each other.
That's right. But what actually ended up happening was because Mars is a pretty big sized planet, so for a planet that size to hit Earth is not something to sneeze at. And so they kind of like smashed into each other and broke apart. And basically both of their mantles, their outer onion layers, got stripped off during this impact. And the core of the Mars-sized planet kind of got assimilated into the Earth-sized planet because it was bigger, so it had more gravity. But both of their mantles ended up getting sprayed out into space, but because, now there's this little proto-Earth there, they're kind of like gravitationally trapped in this disk. So they're kind of like orbiting Earth in this disk, kind of like Saturn's rings, right? And then over the course of like a few days, all of this material that's orbiting around the new Earth that kind of has a Mars-sized core assimilated into it, all of that stuff recoalesced, and that's what our moon is today. So that's our current working hypothesis of how the moon formed. It was a giant impact between the Earth and a Mars-sized planet right when everything was still forming about 4.5 billion years ago.
That's amazing.
I know, right?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's great.
Well, that was fantastic. Oh, so good. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Charlie. You pleased me. Your efforts have borne fruit, and that fruit is sweet. Here is some fruit. Lisa, you get a peach.
Yummy.
Awesome. And Charlie, you get a plum.
Delicious.
You know what they have in common? they both have pits, like a crater. I want to thank my guest, Natasha Allegri from Adventure Time and all the fantastic cartoons she does. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you so much.
I hope you had fun.
I did. That was great.
Awesome. All right. So, to close the show, hey, TIE Fighters, you, our fans, listen, I know you love the show, and I love hearing from you. And let's suppose you want to interact with us, the Titanium Physicists. There are a variety of ways. Why not try following us on Twitter at Titanium Physics, or join our Facebook group. If you'd like to hang out with us and socialize, why not join our online forum? The Brachio Board is a fun place where the fans of the Brachio Media Network gather to chat about science and things. So, let's suppose you want to send me an email directly. Let's suppose you want to propose a topic or ask me a question. Email your questions to barn@titaniumphysics.com. Or, if you just want to tell me nice things, email TIEfighter, TIPHYTER @titaniumphysics.com, because I'm always happy to hear nice things about the hard work we do. Okay, so that's it for the main part of today's show. Remember that if you like listening to scientists talk about science in their own words, you might also want to listen to other shows on the Brachio Media Network, like the Weekly Wienersmith, where Kelly and Zach Wienersmith talk to academics about the research, or Science Sort of, where Charlie drinks beer. So, editing support for the Titanium Physicist podcast is provided by a gentleman named John Heath. Thanks, John. You're doing a great job. The intro song to our show is by Ted Leo and the Pharmacist, and the end song is by John Vanderslice. Thank you, my friends. Until next time, remember to keep science in your hearts.
Angela, don't be mad. There's something I gotta tell you, dear, before you come back here. I lost your bunny. I let him out of the cage. He was eating spring mix on the carpet, jumped through a window out into the haze, hop down Magnolia Boulevard, no way he'll survive.
So there's this thing that physicists describe how energy dissipates, and it's called a 1 over r squared rule. And that's just because we live in a three-dimensional world, so energy dissipates away in this like sphere. So the bolide or the meteor is carrying all of this kinetic energy associated with motion and mass. And then when it strikes, all of that energy has to go somewhere, and so it gets transferred into momentum and a shock wave and heat, and this shock wave will move away in this three-dimensional sphere, or a hemisphere in the case of a planet. That's how so many different forms of energy dissipate. They just spread out from a central point.
So I have these questions, but I don't know if it's because I know untrue science facts. But they say there's bacteria on Mars. Is that true?
No.
No. Okay. Then never mind.
We don't know yet. There very well could be bacteria. In my mind, I can easily see how there could be bacteria on Mars. There's bacteria all over Earth. Ancient Mars had what we call warm and wet conditions. It was above the freezing point of water, so there's liquid water all over the surface of the planet. It would have been a great place for bacteria to live. And under the surface of Mars today, we haven't detected it, but all geophysical models point to the fact that there's water underneath the surface. Well, there's water on the surface, so that means that there's water underneath the surface. And the deeper you go into a planet, the warmer it gets due to radioactive decay of elements within the crust. So that's why if you go deep into a mine on the Earth, it gets really, really warm down there. And so there'll be a point where that frozen water on the surface that then is underneath the surface will then be liquid. So there's likely to be aquifers on the planet Mars. And then the final line of evidence is that because Mars and Earth are relatively near each other within the solar system, rocks from Mars, due to impact events, and again, this is why impact events may be our friend, can kick rocks from Mars onto Earth, and rocks from Earth may have been kicked by impact events all the way to Mars. And so one crude analogy that often people tongue-in-cheek say that baby Mars and baby Earth were like two toddlers in daycare sharing each other's spit, so they're going to come down with the same disease being life.
Right.
So, Natasha, were you asking about the meteorite where they found bacteria?
Yeah, I guess. That's
Allen Hills.
Like the early
98.
2000s? Yeah.
It was during the Clinton administration because he had to do a press conference.
They found this meteorite in Antarctica, which is where we find a lot of meteorites. There's actually an expedition every year. It's a group of people, and they basically get on these snow machines, and they go in a row, basically, basic search pattern, and they're looking for anything that doesn't look like snow, right? Because that's the easiest way to find a rock. If there's a rock just laying by itself in the middle of snow in Antarctica, then probably it came from outer space. So that's
or
kind
somebody's
of
totally trolling them and just laying on.
Or there's some evil aliens who are like planting these little things in Antarctica and laughing at us.
They'd still come from space if it was aliens.
That's true. So anyway, every year they look for these meteorites, and there's a place in Antarctica called Allen Hills. And so they found this meteorite, and they determined that it was from Mars. And one of the ways to do that is to test the trapped gases that are in the meteorite. So if you were like cut it open, there are like little gas bubbles in the pores of these rocks, and you can test those gases and say like, hey, that matches the atmosphere of Mars, which in and of itself is pretty awesome. So anyway, they figured out this thing was from Mars, and they were looking at it under some crazy, I think it was electron microscopes, but I'm not sure about that. And they found this thing that looked like a little worm. And so everybody kind of went berserk, and it like went up and up and up the chain. And the thing about it though was that, so it looked like a little segmented worm, but it was like smaller than bacteria as we know it today. So if it was life, it would have had to be smaller than kind of what we understand the requirements are for life today. But it was so very wormy bacteria shaped that it was hard for anyone to believe that it wasn't life.
The jury, I guess, is still out. But yeah, it's so small that the fundamental chemistry of life, like things like water and sugars and stuff, proteins, those molecules don't fit in it. Those molecules are too big for the size of this worm. And so it's teeny, tiny. And so it's a different kind of life if it is life, or it's not life, or it could be some abiotic, weird mineralogical formation, whatever.
Right. So kind of the explanation that they've kind of come up to explain why this thing looks like a worm is that it's like a very weirdly shaped crystal mineralogical thing that formed on its own in the shape of a worm, which isn't a very satisfying explanation, but that was kind of like, they were like, well, it's not life, so it's got to be a rock, so let's just say that a rock can form in this shape.